Good morning, everyone. We're just going to let everyone get into the webinar and then we will get started. It's great to see so many folks here. Thanks for making time to join us this morning. Really excited about the information we're going to share with you in the next hour. Give it just one more minute as folks are getting logged on. Thanks, you guys, for coming. We appreciate you making time to join us today. We've got just a few more folks trying to get in from logging in, and we'll start in just 1 minute. Okay, I'm Katie Steigers, Vice President of Research at Fahe, and here to welcome you is our CEO, Jim King.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're delighted to be introducing our latest iteration of a housing needs study on this webinar, Exploring Housing Needs in Appalachia. Especially excited to have with us Mel Jones from Virginia Tech and Daniel Eades from University of West Virginia as two of the authors to talk about their findings. And I was reminded of many years ago, before we all had cell phones and Uber at our quick disposal. We were on a family trip and my youngest daughter was maybe 5. We were in Savannah. If you've traveled to anywhere along the coast like that, storms can pop up. And so we found ourselves huddled around this tree, and I don't know, one of the kids said something like, wouldn't it be great if we had a ride? And my youngest said, oh, there's a cab right there. It was relevant and it was timely. And I would say the same 2 words are true of the study that you're going to hear about today. The predominant issues sort of emerging in our country right now are about the widening gap of wealth and income in our country that is creating, I think, in addition to some supply issues around housing, the affordability and the lack of real stock that everyday Americans can afford. And so relevant and timely, I think, come to mind for me as we want to tackle those issues, to be good stewards of the resources that we have and provide great service in the region that we care about. But this also has great, I think, relevance for what's going on in our country as a whole. So with that, welcome, and I look forward to the presentation and then some Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And as he said, we're joined today by Mel Jones, Associate Director of Research at Virginia Tech's Center for Housing Research. Mel is widely known as an expert throughout Appalachia and Virginia on housing challenges in these areas. And we're really delighted that she's able to join us today to present their report. Also joining us is Daniel Eades from West Virginia University's Extension. He's a specialist in rural economics and has a deep understanding of the challenges facing our region related to economics and housing development. And of course, you've already heard from Jim King, Fahe's CEO. He has more than 3 decades of firsthand experience implementing housing initiatives in Appalachia. Jim will continue to provide context on the challenges facing our local communities and share insights on successful approaches that network models like Fahe's are able to achieve. These panelists are going to discuss the key findings of our new housing study on the state of housing in Central Appalachia and Appalachian, Alabama. And without further ado, I'm just going to give you a couple of housekeeping reminders. This session is being recorded. You will have access to a recording following the presentation, and we will be releasing this study publicly very soon. We hope you'll ask questions at the end. If you have questions during the presentation, you can use the Q&A selection at the bottom of your screen, and those questions will get fed to one of our backstage folks, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions and continue a strong discussion about the information in this report. I'm going to turn it over now to Mel Jones and Daniel Eades to present the findings, and hope you will enjoy the presentation. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. It's always a pleasure to present and interact with Fahe members. So we're very happy to be here today. I also, before I get started, want to acknowledge two other team members that we had. Sungbi Choi, who is the postdoctoral associate at the Center for Housing Research at Virginia Tech, and then also Jackie Strager. Both did an immense amount of work, and at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a glimpse into some of the stuff that Jackie did, and we hope to be interacting with you guys soon on those pieces as well. So we'll start with the scope of work, just to give you guys an idea of what we were tasked to do. We wanted to update the 2018 study, so broadly household characteristics and housing characteristics. Then we had some additional opportunities and topics to think about. One of the greatest opportunities we had was to come to your guys' last annual meeting and talk with as many of you as were willing. So that was very enjoyable, and we learned a lot. And as you read the report, you'll see bits and pieces of what you said sort of woven in there, especially when it added additional context to the data or said something a little bit different than the data. And we thought that those things were really important to note, because I've said, and I will say 100 times, when we're in a small community or a small place where the population is quite small, the data is not reliable and there's not a lot we can tell. But at the same time, those small communities make it so that you working in that community can tell a lot. So your insights and intuitions and observations are often just as important as the quantitative data, and putting them together makes the study stronger. So we thank you for that opportunity for sure. We also had a chance to add a couple of topics. So ownership by race, affordability by race. We had a look at the labor force and AMI levels and income limits relative to what the labor force is able to afford. We did some rural, and it says special here. I know that that's like a spell check editing spatial. We did rural spatial analysis, but it was also special. And then finally, we had a chance to look a little bit deeper into energy burden than we did in the last report. Next slide, please. So there are a couple data notes that you also need to keep in mind as you're reading the report. First, the 2020 census and ACS were deemed experimental. During the pandemic, lots of people weren't living in the same house that they usually live in. People were also worried about responding to the census because of things that the administration at the time were saying about the census and how it could be used. People were unable to respond. And it was much harder for folks who work for census to do their usual, we send you a letter, you didn't answer the letter. We send you another letter, you didn't answer it again. We called you, you still didn't answer. We knocked on your door, and then we finally got the information we needed. That process was harder to complete in 2020. So the result was the sample size wasn't big enough and didn't feel reliable enough. So census deemed it experimental. And what does that mean for us? Really, it means that it isn't data that we should be using for policy and program decision making. So throughout the report, if we do have 2020 data shown there, which most of the time you don't, it's faded or shown in a dotted line or other ways to kind of remind you that that data isn't something we're making decisions on. We're going to look at 2019 and 2021 as sort of our bookends. We also always look at the reliability of the data. So we look for a coefficient of variation less than 15. That's a pretty high standard at 15%. And you'll see other standards throughout there, but that is the census's recommendation for policy and program decision making. So that's the one we use. We've tried not to present any data to you in terms of estimates that are unreliable. Sometimes in a map, we will show data that is unreliable because the relationship between places is still the same. So this county has a lower population than that county. That relativity is still the same, but we're not going to give you the population of the county where the data is unreliable. Hopefully that makes sense. We looked at Appalachia from West Virginia to Alabama, all of what ARC defines as Central Appalachia and Appalachian Alabama. We looked at differences between metro and rural areas. We defined metro as those areas included in an MSA, a metropolitan statistical area. And 60% of households in our study area, Central Appalachia, Appalachian Alabama, live in MSAs. The other thing that is detailed in the report is the changes in the MSAs over the two study time periods. So have a look at that if you're interested. We looked to identify trends and contexts, and we'll talk about the examples in more detail later. Document changes, so for example, an increase in households in Alabama and Tennessee and decreases in cost burden. And then outliers. We talk about outliers a lot because essentially we're telling you trends that we believe to be true on a state basis, the Appalachian parts of the states that we looked at very often, and then the ones who don't fit into that trend. So if you're not called out as, this is somebody very, a county or a place that's very different, generally you can assume that you fit in at least into the larger overarching trend. Next slide. Okay, there's lots of context to this report. And we have to analyze this data in that context. And you will see that we did that, mentioned throughout the report, places where we feel like maybe the data doesn't represent what we're experiencing today, or where the data represents what was experienced during the pandemic, or maybe it doesn't represent what was experienced during the pandemic. So y'all are aware of everything that kind of happened. Everybody lived it, right? But the one thing that I really want to point out is that in 2021, federal and state supports for families, especially those families with lower incomes, were still in effect. And that really has an impact on the data. So keep that in mind as you're reading the report. And then the post-pandemic housing market dynamics are sort of what we're living today. So consumers are demanding more space, more access to the outdoors. And then there are ongoing supply constraints. So even today, when you talk to folks who are constructing houses and multifamily buildings, you still hear supply chain issues. And all this in the context of ever increasing demand and still a bit of a lag in the labor department. I've started to hear buzzes that might resolve itself, but still, we're still living with some of that pandemic relic in terms of ability to build. Actually, we're still living with 2008 relics of ability to build. And an ever increasing demand. Right now, all the millennials are ready to, have formed their own households, are maybe thinking about buying homes, and the later generations are starting to fill in there. And, I always feel bad when I say it, but the baby boomers are still alive and kicking and consuming their housing. They are not the greatest generation who, sort of started to pass on like we expected, and free up their housing for other people. So we are in a pretty intense demand scenario right now. And then on top of all of that, we've been dealing with inflation and the increased interest rates in response to that inflation, which has really further marginalized those people who have lower incomes. I heard one loan officer explain, just as we were starting to sort of satisfy the demand of the middle income, the just, low income folk, and finally people who were like 30 to 50% of AMI would have access to housing. That's when the interest rates went up and everything, all their chances sort of went down the drain. So here's what we're looking at: stronger, tighter housing markets. If you look at this map from the prior report, it does not look the same. Now, almost every county in Central Appalachia or Appalachian, Alabama, either has a healthy housing market or a too tight housing market, essentially a supply shortage. And supply shortage counties are shown in the very lightest color. The healthy market folk are sort of in that light green color. And, I want you to take away from this that, in the last report where we were sort of able to see the market conditions reflected by some of the incomes in certain places of Appalachia that have, that history of poverty, now we can't. Now Appalachia is starting to look even more like sort of the rest of the country. And what's happening is the demand is sort of overflowing from everywhere. People are looking for a house anywhere. And now that we're more connected than ever and they can live anywhere, they're demanding housing in Appalachia just like they would the rest of Virginia or the rest of Kentucky or Ohio or Pennsylvania. And so we're starting to see, we have been seeing that just the country is covered up with demand, and Appalachia is no exception. Next slide, please. And there's been some good news about the stronger or tighter housing markets. And, this whole thing is really kind of a good and a bad, right? We have stronger markets, that's good news. We have tighter markets, and for some folks, that's bad news. But the good news is in part that we have less long-term vacancy than we did in the last report, a decrease in long-term vacancy in 85% of counties. These are units that would have been slated for demolition, abandoned, or otherwise held in the long term. Think somebody moved into assisted living or in with family, and they're still holding their home, but nobody's occupying it. So demand being what it is saying, okay, if there's a house that is in perfectly good condition and not occupied, please sell it or please rent it. And they're saying that by the price going up, right? So it's becoming more economically advantageous to go on and put that house into use. It's also meaning there's a lot of investment in properties that needed rehab, that's just sort of naturally happening as a market response. All that's really good news. We're building a little bit. Again, I will underscore that we're not building enough, and not enough fast enough. And part of that is material and labor constraints. Part of it is just the capacity of the industry to build. And meanwhile, we have removed a fair number of units. And if you think back to the last report, or even prior to that, the mobile and manufactured home report that we did even earlier, we talked about how there were lots of units that needed to be removed. And so we're doing it. And, for example, West Virginia has created big grant opportunities for local governments to remove housing stock that is irrelevant or is in too poor of condition, is a health and safety hazard. And so we've done a lot of that. Next slide, please. Okay, so stronger housing markets, they mean lots of opportunities, right? In many of our communities, it means there are new people, people that maybe have never considered living in certain parts of West Virginia or Tennessee, and so on, and now look at it as a great opportunity to take their job with them or find a new job and or retire in a place that they've always wanted to live. And so that's good. New people, it means that we're seeing new houses built in some places that it's been a long time since we saw a new house built. And we're seeing a investment in houses that have needed it for a long time. Maybe that's a new person coming in and buying that house and investing some funds. But sometimes it's also the person that's lived there forever can now see that they'll get a return on that investment and they're investing. So all of that's quite good news. It's really an opportunity overall for community investment and development. And all the time that I've been working on this presentation, I was thinking about your guys' last theme of sort of meet the moment, if you will. And y'all were talking about meet the moment of all of this funding coming in the door. But now you have a new moment to meet, right? Where there's a lot of demand for housing and there are new people moving in. And if we can create the economic and community development context that keeps those people there and the housing that makes it interesting for more people to move here, we have an opportunity for revitalization in places that need it. And that is for both rural and urban spaces, right? Because almost, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, even if you're in an urban place, there are neighborhoods and places that have seen a lack of investment, and those places are getting renewed interest. So it's important to think about this in both contexts. Next slide. Okay, but the tighter version of the housing market, right? It's all good and bad, right? The tighter housing market does have consequences. So increased prices and not enough inventory means displacement for a lot of people. They can't live in the neighborhood that they wanted to anymore or that they once did anymore. They can't move back to that place that their family has roots in because the costs are getting too high. They are right now renting in a place and they thought they were going to be able to buy a home there, but interest rates and prices going up just means that they have to find a new place in order to buy a home, invest in their future, and start building wealth. So there's those types of consequences. Fahe members also mentioned higher development costs, particularly when it comes to competition for developable sites, because there's more demand and more interest from a wider swath of developers in the market. Fahe members mentioned, for that one site, there's so much competition that it means that people trying to develop affordable housing sometimes have to go to the site that will, pencil out, and it's not the first or second choice anymore. So that's one thing to consider. And then something that we're not seeing in the data yet, but again, I will emphasize the context. 2021 data still had those pandemic supports for lower income families. In 2021, we were still seeing the benefits among homeowners of multiple chances to refinance and lower their housing costs. So we'll talk about it more in a second. We're seeing an overall decrease in cost burden right now, but Fahe members really cautioned that what they were seeing in 2022, 2023 is not the story they were seeing in 2021. And so as that new data starts to come out, I urge you to have a look and see what happens to cost burden, because I do anticipate that we're going to start seeing evidence of coping with higher housing costs. And that's, for example, overcrowding families, doubling up in order to afford housing. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to transition a little bit from talking about the overall market to talking about housing affordability. And again, I'll give you a bit of context. We're seeing decreasing levels of cost burden. Appalachia is still relatively affordable compared to the rest of the states. This kind of doesn't count for West Virginia because the whole state is in West Virginia. But if you compare the Appalachian region of Alabama, for example, to the state as a whole, the Appalachian region is still relatively affordable. The tightening housing markets are increasingly excluding the most vulnerable, and there are still persistent disparities based on race, income, and tenure. Also threatening housing conditions, like the condition of your home, still exist. Next slide. Here's the cost burden. It's going down. And a lot of folks say this doesn't feel intuitively right. It's not going down by a huge amount, but it's not up to $1 million anymore like it was in 2015. And I will remind you and ask you to please pay close attention to the two colors of these bars, which represent tenure, right? Renters are blue, owners are orange. A lot of our gains have been among owners. And again, they were benefiting, right up until the inflation took off and we had the interest rate response from opportunities to refinance lower and lower and decrease their costs. So a lot of this movement is from owners. The other sort of natural thing that we expect is the mortgage finance system won't allow you to be cost burdened right at the onset. When you buy your home, and Fahe helps with financing, you're making sure that people can afford a home before you underwrite it. So usually at the onset, people can afford their home. They get cost burden through economic hardship if they're owners. I think somebody passed away, two earner household becomes a one earner household for whatever reason, people retire, they're on fixed incomes, what have you. But most owners through their lifetime, their incomes are increasing while their mortgage payment is staying the same. So they're naturally becoming less cost burden over time. And then with these extra opportunities to refinance, that's where they land. But again, this could reverse itself a little bit as we start to see 2022 and 2023 data. Next slide. Okay, so cost burden continues to disproportionately impact lower income household renters and non-white Hispanic households. You'll see some points there to take away, but also more discussion of this in the report. Overarching, nearly half of all renter households are cost burdened, and a large proportion of them are also severely cost burdened, spending more than 50% of their income on housing. And cost burden levels among householders identifying as Black, African American, Hispanic, or Asian generally have higher levels of cost burden. And with that walks the home ownership, right? They also have lower rates of home ownership, and that gives them less access to all those sort of natural processes that homeowners experience to reduce their housing costs as their, or at least keep their housing costs the same as their incomes increase. And then the other thing that I want to point out is that households who own their home free and clear showed the least improvement in cost burden. And we're anticipating that a lot of this is seniors, folk who maybe used to do all the maintenance on their house and now can't, are on fixed incomes and don't have the money to invest in their house like they once did, or are boomers and never had the money to invest in their house, and now they're seeing the consequences in terms of utilities. Next slide. More than 570,000 households in the region have high energy costs that represent an energy burden. The energy burden is utilities that cost more than 6% of a household's income. And it's most prevalent among people who occupy single family units. Members emphasized that there are needs for critical home repair, system upgrades, and home replacement among a variety of populations, including the seniors, and then also renters who are in substandard single family housing. And I'll remind you that the market, as it tightens, is tending to exclude those people at the very bottom or the most marginalized populations, and very often those folks are renters. And a landlord that has a line out the door to rent their home, they don't feel as inclined to make adjustments or invest in their properties. If you want to complain, you can go, because I've got 5 other people that would love to live here just the way it is. So that's something to consider. And then households impacted by disaster. Next slide. So again, we have these opportunities and consequences of affordability and the market tightness. So because of the market tightness and all the demand in the market right now, denser development is newly feasible in places that it was never before, whether that be because the market just couldn't support, a small scale multifamily building, or because the NIMBYs just wouldn't allow it and they didn't see a need for it. But those things are changing with the market changing. And with that opportunity to build denser, we also have an opportunity to incorporate affordable housing into those developments and really bootstrap this new interest in our communities, in particularly marginalized communities, and use that community revitalization to support the most vulnerable. So including them as we develop more and bigger and denser, including those folks who are at risk for homelessness, for example. And there's a lot of people, almost 10% of people in Appalachia, Central Appalachia and Appalachian Alabama are at risk for homelessness. And then there's also financing improvements. So people are more willing to invest their own funds in housing, but also it makes more sense to take a loan to invest in your home or to build a new home because of the potential for return on that. So there's good parts of this context that can really help with housing affordability. Next slide. But I will say that the build out solution, building enough housing to serve everybody that needs it, seems very distant. And I always say that housing is the long game. And here it is also true. The housing market is becoming increasingly exclusive, and only those places who have really jumped on this and acknowledged the fact that fewer people are able to access housing are turning this around. Most communities that I've worked in so far, they're just starting to realize this, and we're already seeing prolonged homelessness, and we're already seeing, families displaced and seniors displaced. So quickly responding to this market condition and creating more housing is very important, whether that housing is new or preserved or rehabilitated housing. So preservation in these markets is going to be just as important. So keeping that relative affordability that's drawing people to many parts of Appalachia, using this opportunity as a chance to rehabilitate those homes that have been problematic for a long time. And in many of the places where the urban fabric is sort of already set, those rehabilitation and infill pieces are critical to retaining any investment that has been made in a marginalized community, because a dilapidated home is going to impact the property value of any house in about a quarter of a mile. And so those preservation pieces are really important, whether you mean preserving affordability or you mean preserving, our urban fabric and housing stock. Next slide. Okay, So then this is a piece that's going to be forthcoming to you. We've done a lot of work regarding rural geographies and the lack of really good data in rural places. So we did some spatial analysis to try to cluster census tracts by similarities. And we hope that these geographies that we've come out with are at least a good start at grouping together places that are similar enough that I give you a percentage, 25% of people are cost burden in this place, that it is true and reliable throughout the region. There are different stories to tell in each place, but these bigger regions would allow us to go deeper on the data, where right now, if we look at just the county or just the tract, we get a bunch of unreliable data. I can't really tell you anything. So forthcoming at hopefully your caucus meetings, we'll have a chance to show each of these state maps and talk through this with you, and you guys can help us refine it and make it better. Next slide. So key takeaways, smaller houses, ever increasing demand, and new interest in smaller markets can result in denser development that it maybe wasn't viable at some at prior points that we were looking at. So townhomes, small scale multifamily are a great opportunity to incorporate either market affordable or committed affordable housing. And then improved markets and housing shortages. There's good and bad to this, but I think if we can leverage the market strength to support the most vulnerable and preserve affordability across Appalachia, we'll be doing good work. I think that's the last slide. Yep.
All right, I think I'm spotlighted again. And thank you so much, Mel and Daniel. We're going to have a discussion among our panelists now that I will moderate. And I want to encourage everyone in attendance to use the Q&A field at the bottom of the screen and submit questions so that we can discuss those. If you have specific questions, we've already gotten some. We really appreciate that. So if anything piques your interest or you want to know more about definitions or any of the interpretation of the data, please drop those in the Q&A and we'll make sure to get those questions discussed. I'm going to turn first to you, Jim. We looked at, there's a lot of information that has been presented. You're leading a network that covers most of the area that this data discussed represents. What do you see? How can you put this in context in terms of what is going on the ground among community developers and housing agencies? What have we learned in Appalachia that folks in other parts of the country dealing with similar challenges can perhaps benefit from?
That's a long question. So I think one of the things that we heard Mel say was how from the 2018 study to the one that we just got briefed on, Appalachia is beginning to show, I think, trends that look a lot more like the rest of the country, if I heard correctly. And I think that mirrors what I hear from our members who are the boots on the ground, really doing work. I think the pressures on particularly lower income families have been building for quite some time, and so the relief packages that came with COVID, I think, masked I think a lot of the real burden we were feeling from people. And I'd also say, as I try to match then, I think what I'm hearing and feeling right now, given that a lot of the data sets only run through 21, the last 2 years, I think, are revealing an awful lot more pain for folks, right? I'm not I'm not a PhD economist, but I try to follow some of these economic trends. And inflation is really actually personal, right? It's like, what do I have to buy, and what does that cost me now compared to how I felt about it last month or last year? And so I think things like how cost burden is now affecting folks, particularly when we think about energy costs. I believe one of the biggest providers in Eastern Kentucky is announcing an 18% increase in utility rates. When I moved to Kentucky 30 something years ago, this was one of the least expensive places to buy to pay for utilities in the country on a kilowatt hour basis. Now trending really fast. Well, that hits people in a very, very difficult way, right? Like if you're making choices about whether to heat or eat. So I think just in terms of like temperature, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of this is matching what we're hearing from members, as well as I think you can put a common sense sort of cover over it and say, well, okay, yeah, I can see where this is headed, and where it's headed next doesn't look better than where we are today, right? I think Mel mentioned it as well. Communities that have not already been giving this a lot of thought about affordability and what has to be in place. It's a little bit like saying, well, I know a tornado or a flood is coming. We should prep now. Well, the time to prep was, the opportune moment passed, as Jack Sparrow said, right? So I don't know if that gets to all of the question, but I feel like I should yield the floor a little bit, Katie.
Thanks, Jim. Daniel, I wanted to know if you would speak a little bit about some of the trends or pieces of the report that you have special expertise in. If there's anything you would like to draw our attention to as we're looking back on this in a couple weeks.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of the work that I was doing for this focused on the energy costs, and I think Jim absolutely hit the nail on the head. And one of the things that we always talk about for those folks that are already, those housing burden folks. I mean, I think again, Jim said it. I mean, those are the folks who are making choices between, am I going to pay my rent, or am I going to buy medicine? And I think that as those supports have been taken away, we're seeing a much larger number of people who are having to make those choices. And I think, I mean, we're seeing that on the ground here in the state. And we're facing a lot of the same issues with we've got power plants being closed or transitioned. So I think a lot of those households that maybe didn't appear as energy burdened in the data now are going to be showing up as energy burdened in the future. And I think combining that with high housing costs for a lot of people is going to present a real double whammy that we're going to have to address.
Yeah, that actually also makes me think of some other areas that probably are affecting this, even if someone, like Mel said, is starting off in an affordable dwelling, whether they're renting or owning. But as childcare costs increase, as medical costs increase, and then things like groceries or so forth, maybe for Mel or Jim, maybe in turn, why is it critical, or would you argue that it's critical to keep that housing affordable and stable when some of these other things are maybe chipping away at folks' ability to make ends meet? It seems like, for me, my perspective is maybe that housing is like a linchpin, and even if it looks like your housing is affordable, that's not necessarily an indicator of what else is not as affordable for you.
So generally, housing is a household's biggest cost, right? And followed by transportation and then childcare if you have it. And so, if we can keep the affordability of housing down, then that's great. But I will say, I often tell people paying 30% of your income for housing is a lot. And, that's our measure for affordability. Do you spend more or less than 30% of your income for housing? And there's a lot of people who are, in that low or moderate income category that paying 30% of your housing income towards housing really puts you in a vulnerable position, right? Because then those little costs change or the big costs change slightly, and suddenly you find yourself in a really tough position. And that's a bit of a problem with the way we look at housing generally. And I often point people towards the MIT living wage calculator so that you can see, that if you have big childcare costs because you have 3 kids, 2 working adults earning moderate wages, your housing needs to be a lot lower than 30% of your income in order to keep you in a safe place. So there's a lot of work that we still need to do on housing affordability for everybody, despite sort of this creeping down of people who spend 30% of their income for housing, because if you spend 28% of your income for housing, you're still in very often a vulnerable situation. And I'll underscore again that I think it's like 9.3% of people across Appalachia are at risk for homelessness. So they have extremely low incomes and they're cost burdened. So you have a lot of people that are in pretty vulnerable situations that those are the worst off, right? But as you go up and maybe people's cost burden disappear in the cost burden data, that they're still in a situation that isn't ideal.
Jim, is there anything you want to follow up on that, or I have another question for you, hopefully shorter than the last one.
I don't know if I have a short answer to add. I think I only have a long answer, but I think Mel's hitting on something that is that I just don't want to let go quite yet. That notion of 30% of your income as a measure of affordability, I think we need to seriously consider how we challenge that. And so thanks for bringing that up, Mel. I mean, I think that's right, because if you just back up and reframe this a little bit from the most vulnerable families to who's next on the list that's going to end up in that category, and I think that's an ever-growing group of folks. I have the folks who are on this webinar who know a little bit more about my family know I have a daughter who is a professor at the University of Kentucky. And not long ago, she and I had a conversation where she's like, one of the things people don't talk about is the number of professionals who have gigs to supplement their income because the cost of being close to the university has now become difficult on the salaries that they have to maintain a certain standard of living. Well, if that's true for people who have a like a doctorate or a master's degree and are working in that setting, then I think, just as an anecdote, I think that fits with every statistic we're hearing about, like the real pressure on people, and cost of transportation, the cost of utilities, the cost of healthcare, childcare, all of these things. When inflation hits those things, it ought to influence the way then we think about what's the index for affordability. And too often, I think, not just the mortgage industry, but think about how Section 8 is calculated. It is very rear view mirror. So
yeah, some really important comments there, and also showing up in the Q&A, just simply how low some people's incomes really are and what that means day to day. Thank you all for just putting a little bit more texture into this report. We're going to switch now to the Q&A. We've got quite a few questions that we'd like to get to. Our research associate, Camila Moreno, will be reading these out in the order that we received them. And we're just going to have to see, I think, if you all can sort of indicate if you want to answer that, and then our backstage folks will spotlight the person who's answering. So Camila, go ahead, and if you'll start with, I think it was Scott's first question.
Sure, thank you. So the first question asks, can you explain the data that says we have healthy housing markets? Because that does not match our experience on the ground. And I will add a follow-up. I would question whether this defines a healthy housing market. I would hate for funders to see the map showing most of Central Appalachia having a healthy housing market. Maybe more specificity may be needed.
Yeah, and Camilla, I think you did a good job of at least adding some detail in the Q&A. So another way to think about it, rather than say healthy, if you feel like that's too broad, is more balanced. So there isn't, the vacancy is decreasing such that the quantity of housing that is available in the market for sale or for rent feels correct. So that's those folks who have a vacancy rate between 2 and 7%. It only is the market vacancy, right? So it is those units that are for sale or for rent are the numerator, and then all housing units are the denominator. So it's not including long-term vacancies or single or seasonal, occasional use vacancies. The dilapidated housing that's not for sale, is abandoned, is not included there. So really the interpretation of that map should be there's enough demand in the market, and there are enough housing units in the market to kind of balance them out. It's a wide range from 2 to 7% being healthy. Some folks may feel that, you know, when you get closer up to 7%, it's starting to feel like there's a lot of vacancies. Some folks that would argue, you know, as soon as you're down to 2%, you're in a too tight situation, right? It's a rule of thumb, which always is questionable. Any rule of thumb, right, it has more details to it. And so, you know, I would definitely encourage you, Katie and Camilla will have all of our spreadsheets and can hit that number for your county if you want. And that might help explain the variation, because that map is very simple, right? Anybody with less than 2 is in a too tight market. Anybody with greater than 7 is in sort of a weak market with too much vacancy. And then the between 2 and 7 is roughly called healthy. And a lot of times, you know, I've dealt with this between 2 and 7 number quite a bit, and heard a lot from property managers and realtors when we're in this environment. And there's a lot to think about here, right? If you're a property manager, you would rather be in a too tight environment, right? Because then you have a long list of people who want to live in your property. You don't have to invest a whole lot on turnover, because people are just sort of taking what they can get. It's a take what you can get market. And so, you know, anytime I tell a property manager that between 2 and 7 is healthy, they're like, no, you know, I want it down to like 1.5. I don't want to see any vacancy. But from a community perspective, we want to see some vacancies, so people are encouraged to keep their properties up and compete for renters. But then we don't want to see it go so far that they're worried about leasing up their property. So they don't want to invest because they're worried about return on that investment. The same is for homeowners, right? Like we like this 2 and 7% days on the market between 30 and 60%, because we want homeowners to feel confident that if they put their house on the market, they can sell it in a couple of months. You know, they feel confident of that. But then we don't want buyers to be put into a situation where they have to make, you know, bid sight unseen and offer sight unseen and waive inspections and all of that, because that really disadvantages people who need unconventional financing. So there's a lot going in there between the 2 and 7%, and healthy is really shorthand for, you know, balanced from a community perspective. But there's a lot of variation between 2 and 7. So there's stories to tell in between.
Thanks, Mel. I'm going to keep these anonymous. If you feel you want to come out for your question, totally fine. The next question is, what can be done for, oh, excuse me. 2 questions. The first one is, what can be done in rural non-incorporated areas dominated by Jenny Lind houses and haulers? And the second is, what can be built with available funds for those who are homeless, and how can one qualify for them? How is homeless defined? And does it include overcrowding? And I can repeat any of it if you need it.
This is like, yeah, an enormous question. I mean, I'm going to go back first, because that's like what I can remember. So first of all, the report didn't look explicitly at homelessness. So those people experiencing homelessness were not included. And we get that data from things like the point in time count, which are less reliable in rural places. We did spend a tiny bit of time just reflecting on members' experiences of people experiencing homelessness, often in rural contexts where they're sheltering in an abandoned building or in a utility shed, or couch surfing, so doubled up in that context. There are a number of definitions of homelessness floating out there. There is the McKinney-Vento definition that is applied in public schools and to children primarily. In that context, doubling up or couch surfing would indicate that you're experiencing homelessness. In the strict HUD definition, they are talking about people who are experiencing literal homelessness. So somebody sheltering in a shed or an abandoned building would certainly be experiencing homelessness, but someone living with family or couch surfing from family member to family member, if you're an adult, would not qualify you as experiencing homelessness. So those are the two major definitions, but there are others out there. And particularly, if you're coming at this from the direction of community service board type entity where you're working with people who are experiencing mental health or physical disabilities or substance use disorder, those kinds of things, they have additional definitions of housing insecurity and homelessness. Okay, the next question is about
Mel
how
and
to
Camila, I'm
yeah.
gonna hop in real quick. We've really got about 2 minutes left,
Oh.
and so we just want to let folks know we're going to go ahead and take one more question, but we understand if you do need to drop off right at the hour. We want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. If you could talk a little bit, Mel, in this last question, what is the this is from one of the attendees. Wondering if your data would indicate that the housing shortage or housing production is being impacted by folks who are not able or willing to pay the 30% of income used for cost burden. In other words, there might actually be more income available than what's being spent. So that sounds like people maybe under consuming housing. And I know you have talked about that. I see Daniel nodding as well. So that'll be our last question. We'll capture these and the full report will go out to folks who are interested in some of the data. And also we'll try to email you directly if you'll drop your contact information in the chat. But I'm going to let them answer, and that'll be our last question.
Well, I mean, I will just say from the work that I've done in more local places in West Virginia, that's a huge issue. It'd be because you've got supply issues all the way through that pipeline. So, I mean, one, people don't want to be spending a huge amount on housing if they don't have to. But number two, if there's not quality housing for them to move up into, you're going to have that issue and you end up getting these bottlenecks. So I would say, at least in the more rural places in West Virginia that I've been working, that is definitely an issue.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that the strength and demand in the markets will help reverse that a little bit. We talked a tiny bit about funding before and what funders would think about healthy markets, but if you're trying to get a project financed and the market is showing that there is demand in that market, you're in one of those too tight scenarios. It should help with funding to some degree, especially conventional funding for development. So wouldn't it be great if in this context of a too tight or very healthy market, we could get some market rate housing developed that relieved a little bit of pressure on the middle, which, the vast majority of our communities everywhere, right? Most of the housing is existing housing, aging housing that represents what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. And that is going to be our majority stock of housing, no matter what, right? That aging, naturally occurring affordable housing. But if we have high income owners consuming all of that because the market isn't building anything new or bigger or better located, then it's all stagnant. We have no churn. which is the real danger of a too tight market, is it becomes gridlocked. So.
Great, thank you. We're going to have a concluding comment from Jim King. And again, just thank you so much to Mel and Daniel and their colleagues for this report, and you all for your time, and Camila for moderating Q&A. Jim, it's your turn.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to have a word in here, and I would agree, Katie. Thank you, Daniel and Mel, and then Katie, you and your team for putting this on. I mean, I think I think this is to go back to the meeting the moment phrase that Mel mentioned we used not long ago. This is a different moment than where we've been, and I do think that there needs to be some bit of a call to action that comes from this, and we'll be framing that up using a lot of the data that's here. I think I heard some comments about like, well, what this doesn't match what we feel or whatever. I think, you know, how an organization like Fahe and the members choose to make use of this study, it's ours. We need more of this kind of data. I would definitely say that, and so if there are any funders on this call, I mean, it's really important that you give us good information that we can work with. How we choose to advocate. I mean, I think this is not a homeless issue or an unincorporated rural places issue, right? This is about housing markets as they generally affect. And that certainly that has a cause and effect that I think is hitting every community in our region right now, where we've got a greater number of folks suffering with what it costs or whether or not they can even find something they can afford. And so how do we strengthen the messaging? How do we bring state, federal, and local resources, I think, to bear to help people see this is an issue we all need to tackle? How do we strengthen members is something that we're going to be paying more attention to. And then how do we expand access to programs that we know already work, and things like the USDA 502 program, as well as I think some of the private money others have put together. So what's our challenge going to be, and what's our plan going to be to attack that challenge, I think is where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So this concludes the presentation of the housing needs in Central Appalachia and housing in Appalachia and Alabama. Again, if you've got further follow-up questions, just feel free to email me. And if you are registered for the webinar, which you obviously are, we'll email a copy of the report out when we publish that in just a short time, sometime maybe in the next week or two, and you'll get a recording. So thank you again for being with us, and thanks again to Mel and Daniel for presenting, and Jim for joining us with comments. Have a great afternoon.